Hi. After it's been much requested, I am going to read the next instalment of Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. Chapter 1. I spent the last afternoon of the fall constructing a 1 in 10,000 scale replica of the Empire State Building from boxes of adult diapers. It was a thing of beauty, really, spanning 5 feet at its base and towering above the cosmetics aisle, with jumbos for the foundation, lights for the observation deck, and meticulously stacked trial sizes for its iconic spire. It was almost perfect, minus one crucial detail. "You used Neverleak," Shelley said, eyeing my craftsmanship with sceptical frown. "The sales on Stay Tight?" Shelley was the store manager, and her slumped shoulders and dour expression were as much a part of her uniform as the blue polo shirts we all had to wear. "I thought you said Neverleak," I said, because she had. "Stay Tight," she insisted, shaking her head regretfully, as if my tower were a crippled racehorse and she the bearer of the pearl-handled pistol. There was a brief but awkward silence in which she continued to shake her head and shift her eyes from me to the tower and back to me again. I stared blankly at her, as if completely failing to grasp what she was passive-aggressively implying. "Oh," I said finally, "you mean you want me to do it over?" "It's just that you used Neverleak," she repeated. "No problem, I'll get started right away." With the toe of my regulation black sneaker, I nudged a single box from the tower's foundation. In an instant, the whole magnificent structure was cascading down around us, sending a tidal wave of diapers crashing across the floor, boxes caroming off the legs of startled customers, skidding as far as the automatic door, which slid open, letting in a rush of August heat. Shelley's face turned the colour of ripe pomegranate. She should have fired me on the spot, but I knew I'd never be so lucky. I'd been trying to get fired from Smart Aid all summer, and it had proved next to impossible. I came in late, repeatedly, and with the flimsiest of excuses, made shockingly incorrect change, even misshelved things on purpose, stocking lotions among laxatives and birth control with baby shampoo. Rarely had I worked so hard at anything, and yet, no matter how incompetent I pretended to be, Shelley stubbornly kept me on the payroll. Let me qualify my previous statement. It was next to impossible for me to get fired from Smart Aid. Any other employee would have been out the door a dozen minor infractions ago. It was my first lesson in politics. There are 3 Smart Aids in Englewood, the small, somnolent beach town where I live. There are 27 in Sarasota County and 115 in all of Florida, spreading across the state like some untreatable rash. The reason I couldn't be fired was that my uncles owned every single one of them. The reason I couldn't quit was that working at Smart Aid as your first job had long been a hallowed family tradition. All my campaign of self-sabotage had earned me was an unwinnable feud with Shelley and the deep and abiding resentment of my co-workers, who, let's face it, were going to resent me anyway, because no matter how many displays I knocked over or customers I shortchanged, one day I was going to inherit a sizable chunk of the company, and they were not. Wading through the diapers, Shelley poked her finger into my chest and was about to say something dour when the PA system interrupted her. "Jacob, you have a call on line 2. Jacob, line 2. She glared at me as I backed away, leaving her pomegranate faced amid the ruins of my tower. The employee lounge was a dank, windowless room where I found the pharmacy assistant Linda nibbling a crustless sandwich in the vivid glow of the soda machine. She nodded at a phone screwed to the wall. "Line 2's for you. Whoever it is sounds freaked." I picked up the dangling receiver. "Jakob, is that you?" "Hi, Grandpa Portman." "Jakob, thank God, I need my key. Where's my key?" He sounded upset, out of breath. "What key?" "Don't play games," he snapped. "You know what key." "You probably just misplaced it." "Your father put you up to this," he said. "Just tell me. He doesn't have to know." "Nobody put me up to anything." I tried to change the subject. "Did you take your pills this morning?" "They're coming for me, understand? I don't know how they found me after all these years, but they did. What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to fight them with? The goddamn butter knife?" It wasn't the first time I'd heard him talk like this. My grandfather was getting old, and frankly, he was starting to lose it. The signs of his mental decline had been subtle at first, like forgetting to buy groceries or calling my mother by my aunt's name. But over the summer, his encroaching dementia had taken a cruel twist. The fantastic stories he'd invented about his life during the war, the monsters, the enchanted island, had become completely, oppressively real to him. He'd been especially agitated in the last few weeks, and my parents, who feared he was becoming a danger to himself, were seriously considering putting him into a home. For some reason, I was the only one who received this apocalyptic phone calls from him. As usual, I did my best to calm him down. "You're safe, everything's fine. I'll bring over a video for us to watch later. How's that sound?" "No, stay where you are, it's not safe here." "Grandpa, the monsters aren't coming for you. You killed them all in the war, remember?" I turned to face the wall, trying to hide my end of this bizarre conversation from Linda, who shot me a curious glance when she pretended to read a fashion magazine. "Not all of them," he said. No, I killed a lot, sure, but there was always more." I could hear him banging around his house, opening drawers, slamming things. He was in full meltdown. "You stay away, hear me? I'll be fine. Cut out their tongues and stab them in the eyes. That's all you gotta do. If I could just find that goddamn key." The key in question opened a giant locker in Grandpa Portman's garage. Inside was a stockpile of guns and knives sufficient to arm a small militia. He'd spent half his life collecting them, travelling to out-of-state gun shows, going on long hunting trips and dragging his regular family to rifle ranges on sunny Sundays so they could learn to shoot. He loved his guns so much that sometimes he even slept with them. My dad had an old snapshot to prove it. Grandpa Portman napping with a pistol in his hand. Here's the picture. I don't know if it's very clear, sorry. When I asked my dad why Grandpa was so crazy about guns, he said it sometimes happened to people who used to be soldiers or who had experienced traumatic things. I guess that after everything my grandfather had been through, he never really felt safe anywhere, not even at home. The irony was, now that delusions and paranoia were starting to get the best of him, it was true. He wasn't safe at home, not with all those guns around. That's why my dad had swiped the key. I repeated the lie that I didn't know where it was. There was more swearing and banging at Grandpa Portman, stomped around looking for it. "Fair," he said finally. "Let your father have the key if it's so important to him. Let him have my dead body too." I got off the phone as politely as I could and then called my dad. "Grandpa's flipping out," I told him. "Has he taken his pills today?" "He won't tell me, doesn't sound like it though." I heard my dad sigh. "Can you stop by and make sure he's okay? I can't get off work right now." My dad volunteered part-time at the bird rescue, where he helped rehabilitate snowy egrets hit by cars and pelicans that had swallowed fishhooks. He was an amateur ornithologist and a wannabe nature writer, with a stack of unpublished manuscripts to prove it, which are real jobs only if you happen to be married to a woman whose family owns 115 drugstores. Of course, mine was not the realest of jobs either, and it was easy to ditch whenever I felt like it. I said I would go. "Thanks, Jake. I promise we'll get all this grandpa stuff sorted out soon, okay?" "All this grandpa stuff? You mean put him in a home?" I said. "Make him someone else's problem?" "Mum and I haven't decided yet." "Of course you have." "Jacob, I can handle him, Dad, really." "Well, maybe now you can, but he's only going to get worse." "Fine, whatever." I hung up and called my friend Ricky for a ride. 10 minutes later I heard the unmistakable throaty honk of his ancient Crown Victoria in the parking lot. On my way out, I broke the bad news to Shelley. Her tower of Stay Tight would have to wait until tomorrow. "Family emergency," I explained. "Right," she said. I emerged into the sticky hot evening to find Ricky smoking on the hood of his battered car. Something about his mud-encrusted boots and the way he let smoke curl from his lips, and how the sinking sun lit his green hair, reminded me of a punk redneck James Dean. He was all of those things, a bizarre cross-pollination of subcultures, possibly only in South Florida. He saw me and leapt off the hood. "You fired yet?" he shouted across the parking lot. "Shh," I hissed, running towards him. "They don't know my plan." Ricky punched my shoulder in a manner meant to be encouraging, but that nearly snapped my rotator cuff. Don't worry, Special Ed, there's always tomorrow. He called me Special Ed because I was in a few gifted classes, which were, technically speaking, part of our school's special education curriculum, a subtlety of nomenclature that Ricky found endlessly amusing. That was our friendship, equal parts irritation and cooperation. The cooperation part was an unofficial brains for brawn trade agreement we'd worked out, in which I helped him not fail English, and he helped me not get killed by the roided out sociopaths who prowled the halls of our school. That he made my parents deeply uncomfortable was merely a bonus. He was, I suppose, my best friend, which is a less pathetic way of saying he was my only friend. Ricky kicked the Crown Vic's passenger door, which was how you opened it, and I climbed in. The Vic was amazing, a museum-worthy piece of unintentional folk art. Ricky bought it from the town dump with a jar of quarters, or so he claimed. A pedigree whose odour even the forest of air freshener trees he'd hung from the mirror couldn't mask. The seats were armoured with duct tape so that errant upholstery springs wouldn't find their way up your ass. Best of all was the exterior, a rusted moonscape of holes and dents, the result of a plan to earn extra gas money by allowing drunken partygoers to whack the car with a golf club for $1 a swing. The only rule which had not been rigorously enforced was that you couldn't aim at anything made of glass. The engine rattled to life in a cloud of blue smoke. As we left the parking lot and rolled past strip malls toward Grandpa Portman's house, I began to worry about what we might find when we got there. Worst-case scenarios included my grandfather running naked in the street, wielding a hunting rifle, foaming at the mouth on the front lawn, or lying in wait with a blunt object in his hand. Anything was possible, and that this would be Ricky's first impression of a man I'd spoken about with reverence made me especially nervous. The sky was turning to the colour of a fresh bruise as we pulled into my grandfather's subdivision, a bewildering labyrinth of interlocking cul-de-sacs known collectively as Circle Village. We stopped at the guard gate to announce ourselves, but the old man in the booth was snoring and the gate was wide open, as was often the case, so we just drove in. My phone chirped with a text from Dad asking how things were going, and in the short time it took me to respond, Ricky managed to get us completely stunningly lost. When I said I had no idea where we were, he cursed and pulled a succession of squealing U-turns, spitting arcs of tobacco juice from his window as I scanned the neighbourhood for a familiar landmark. It wasn't easy, even though I'd been to visit my grandfather countless times growing up, because each house looked like the next, squat and boxy with minor variations, trimmed with aluminium siding or dark 70s wood, or fronted by plaster colonnades that seemed almost delusionally aspirational. Street signs, half of which had turned a blank and blistered white from sun exposure, were little help. The only real landmarks were bizarre and colourful lawn ornaments, of which Circle Village was a veritable open-air museum. Finally, I recognised a mailbox held aloft by a metal butler that, despite his strange back and snooty expression, appeared to be crying tears of rust. I shouted at Ricky to turn left. The Vic's tyres screeched and I was flung against the passenger door. The impact must have jarred something loose in my brain, because suddenly the directions came rushing back to me. Right at the Flamingo Orgy, left at the Multi-Technic Roof Santas, straight past the Pissing Cherubs. And when we passed the Cherubs, Ricky slowed to a crawl and peered doubtfully down my grandfather's block. There was not a single porch light on, not a TV glowing behind a window, not a town car in a carport. All the neighbours had fled north to escape the punishing summer heat, leaving yard gnomes to drown in lawns gone wild and hurricane shutters shut tight so that each house looked like a little pastel bomb shelter. Last one on the left, I said. Ricky tapped the accelerator and we sputtered down the street. At the fourth or fifth house we passed an old man watering his lawn. He was bald as an egg and stood in a bathrobe and slippers, spraying the ankle-high grass. The house was dark and shuttered like the rest. I turned to look and he seemed to stare back, though he couldn't have. I realised with a small shock because his eyes were a perfect milky white. That's strange, I thought. Grandpa Portman never mentioned that one of his neighbours was blind. The street ended at a wall of scrub pines and Ricky hung the sharp left into my grandfather's driveway. He cut the engine, got out and kicked my door open. Our shoes hushed through the dry grass to the porch. I rang the bell and waited. A dog barked somewhere, a lonely sound in the muggy evening. When there was no answer, I banged on the door, thinking maybe the bell had stopped working. Ricky swatted at the gnats that had begun to clothe us. "Maybe he stepped out," Ricky said, grinning. "Hot day." "Go ahead and laugh," I said. "He's got a better shot than we do any night of the week. This place is crawling with eligible widows." I joked, only to calm my nerves. The quiet made me anxious. I fetched the extra key from its hiding place in the bushes. "Wait here." "Hell I am. Why?" "Because you're 6'5" and have green hair, my grandfather doesn't know you and owns a lot of guns." Ricky shrugged and stuck another wad of tobacco in his cheek. He went to stretch himself on a lawn chair as I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Even in the fading light, I could tell the house was a disaster. It looked like it had been ransacked by thieves. Bookshelves and cabinets had been emptied, the knickknacks and large print Reader's Digest that had filled them thrown across the floor. Couch cushions and chairs were overturned, the fridge and freezer doors hung open, their contents melting into sticky puddles on the linoleum. My heart sank. Grandpa Portman had really, finally lost his mind. I called his name but heard nothing. I went from room to room, turning on the lights and looking anywhere a paranoid old man might hide from monsters. Behind furniture, in the attic crawl space, under the workbench in the garage. I even checked inside his weapons cabinet, though of course it was locked. The handle ringed by scratches where he tried to pick it. Out on the lanai, a gallows of unwatered ferns swung browning in the breeze, while on my knees on the astroturfed floor I peered beneath rattan benches, afraid what I might discover. I saw a gleam of light from the backyard. Running through the screen door, I found a flashlight abandoned in the grass. Its beam pointed at the woods that edged my grandfather's yard, a scrubby wilderness of sawtooth palmettos and trash palms that ran for a mile between Circle Village and the next subdivision, Century Woods. According to local legend, the woods were crawling with snakes, raccoons, and wild boars. When I pictured my grandfather out there, lost and raving in nothing but his bathrobe, a black feeling welled up inside me. Every other week there was a news story about some geriatric citizen tripping into a retention pond and being devoured by alligators. The worst-case scenario wasn't hard to imagine. I shouted for Ricky, and a moment later he came tearing around the side of the house. Right away he noticed something I hadn't, a long, mean-looking slice in the screen door. He let out a low whistle. "That's a hell of a cut. Wild pig could have done it, or a bobcat maybe. You should see the claws on them things." A peal of savage barking broke out nearby. We both started, then traded a nervous glance. "Or a dog?" I said. The sound triggered a chain reaction across the neighborhood, and soon barks were coming from every direction. "Could be," Ricky said, nodding. "I got a .22 in my trunk. You just wait." And he walked off to retrieve it. The barks faded, and a chorus of night insects rose up in their place, droning and alien. Sweat trickled down my face. It was dark now, but the breeze had died, and somehow the air seemed hotter than it had done all day. I picked up the flashlight and stepped toward the trees. My grandfather was out there somewhere, I was sure of it. But where? I was no tracker, neither was Ricky, and yet something seemed to guide me anyway. A quickening in the chest, a whisper in the vicious air, and suddenly I couldn't wait another second. I tromped into the underbush like a bloodhound, scenting an invisible trail. It's hard to run in a Florida woods, where every square foot not occupied by trees is a bristling with thigh-high palmetto spears and nets of entangling skunk vine, but I did my best, calling my grandfather's name and sweeping my flashlight everywhere. I caught a white glint out of the corner of my eye and made a beeline for it, but upon closer inspection it turned out to be just a bleached and deflated soccer ball I'd lost years ago. I was about to give up and go back for Ricky when I spied a narrow corridor of freshly stomped palmettos not far away. I stepped into it and shone my light around. The leaves were splattered with something dark. My throat went dry. Steeling myself, I began to follow through the trail. The farther I went, the more my stomach knotted, as though my body knew what lay ahead and was trying to warn me. And then the trail of the flattened brush widened out, and I saw him. My grandfather lay face down in a bed of creeper, his legs sprawled out and one arm twisted beneath him as if he'd fallen from a great height. I thought surely he was dead. His undershirt was soaked with blood, his pants were torn, and one shoe was missing. For a long moment I just stared, the beam of my flashlight shivering across his body. When I could breathe again, I said his name, but he didn't move. I sank to my knees and pressed the flat of my hand against his back. The blood that soaked through was still warm. I could feel him breathing ever so shallowly. I slid my arms under him and rolled him onto his back. He was alive, though just barely, his eyes glassy, his face sunken and white. Then I saw the gashes across his midsection and nearly fainted. They were wide and deep and clotted with soil, and the ground where he lay was muddy from blood. I tried to pull his rags off his shirt over the wounds without looking at them. I heard Ricky shout from the backyard, "I'm here!" I screamed, and maybe I should have said more, like danger or blood, but I couldn't form the words. All I could think was that grandfathers were supposed to die in beds, in hushed places, humming with machines, not in heaps on the sodden, reeking ground with ants marching over them, a brass letter opener clutched in one trembling hand. A letter opener. That was all he'd had to defend himself. I slid it from his fingers, and he grasped helplessly at the air, so I took his hand and held it. My nail-bitten fingers twinned with his, pale and webbed with purple veins. "I have to move you," I told him, sliding one arm under his back and another under his legs. I began to lift, but he moaned and went rigid, so I stopped. I couldn't bear to hurt him. I couldn't leave him either, and there was nothing to do but wait. So I gently brushed loose soil from his arms and face and thinning white hair. That was when I noticed his lips moving. His voice was barely audible. Something less than a whisper. I leaned down and put my ear to his lips. He was mumbling, fading in and out of lucidity, shifting between English and Polish. "I don't understand," I whispered. I repeated his name until his eyes seemed to focus on me, and then he drew a sharp breath and said quietly but clearly, "Go to the island, Jakob. Here it's not safe." It was the old paranoia. I squeezed his hand and assured him we were fine. He was going to be fine. That was twice in one day that I'd lied to him. I asked him what happened, what animal had hurt him, but he wasn't listening. "Go to the island," he repeated. "You'll be safe there, promise me." "I will, I promise." What else could I say? "I thought I could protect you," he said. "I should have told you a long time ago." I could see the life going out of him. "Told me what?" I said, choking back tears. "There's no time," he whispered. Then he raised his head off the ground, trembling with the effort, and breathed into my ear. "Find the bird in the loop on the other side of the old man's grave, September 3rd, 1940. I nodded, but he could see that I didn't understand. With his last bit of strength, he added, "Emerson, the letter. Tell them what happened, Jakob." With that, he sunk back, spent and fading. I told him I loved him, and then he seemed to disappear into himself, his gaze drifting past me to the sky, bristling now with stars. A moment later, Ricky crashed out of the underbrush. He saw the old man limp at my arms and fell back a step. "Oh man, oh Jesus, he said, rubbing his face with his hands, and as he babbled about finding a pulse and calling the cops and "Did you see anything in the woods?" the strangest feelings came over me. I let go of my grandfather's body and stood up, every nerve ending tingling with an instinct I didn't know I had. There was something in the woods, all right. I could feel it. There was no moon and no movement in the underbrush but our own, and yet somehow I knew just when to raise my flashlight and just where to aim it. And for an instant, in that narrow cut of light, I saw a face that seemed to have been transplanted directly from the nightmares of my childhood. It stared back with eyes that swam in dark liquid, furrowed trenches of carbon black flesh loose on its hunched frame, its mouth hinged open grotesquely so that a mass of long eel-like tongues could wriggle out. I shouted something and then it twisted and was gone, shaking the brush and drawing Ricky's attention. He raised his .22 and fired, pap, 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 saying, "What was that? What the hell was that?" But he hadn't seen it and I couldn't speak to tell him. Frozen in place as I was, my dying flashlight flickering over the blank woods, and then I must have blacked out because he was saying, "Jacob, Jake, hey, Ed." Hey, that's the last thing I remember.